Next speaker is Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines welcomes warmly the delegation of LAO PDR to this UPR session. My delegation welcomes the positive steps taken by the government to implement the UPR recommendations from the last cycle. We commend LAO PDR for the advances made in the area of development and poverty reduction, including on basic education and health care services. In a constructive spirit, the Philippines recommends the following: to further intensify its efforts on human rights education and capacity building for duty bearers and stakeholders. Number 2, to continue to enhance measures and programs to combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children. 3, to continue to implement measures to improve the political participation of women. And 4, take further steps to enhance the access of social services by vulnerable sectors, including women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, among others. We wish our fellow ASEAN member LAO PDR every success in this review cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Poland.
Thank you, Vice President. Poland would like to thank the delegation of the LAO People's Democratic Republic for its national report and for active participation in the UPR process. Poland observes with appreciation the efforts to implement the recommendations made during the second UPR cycle, including efforts to improve the developed national laws and legislations in line with UN human rights standards. However, we are concerned about the situation of the human rights defenders, including detention and enforced disappearances, such as the case of disappearance of Sombat Sompone 7 years ago. We also note with concern the forced relocation of a number of local communities as a result of large development project investment. Therefore, Poland recommends to conduct thorough, independent and impartial investigation to clarify all unexplained and forced disappearances of human rights defenders in Laos, to ensure that population relocation as a result of land concession to development projects are carried out in accordance with relevant international standards, in particular the principle of non-discrimination and with adequate consultation and compensation, to adopt legal provision to criminalize all forms of sexual exploitation of children in compliance with international legal standards, specifically on sexual exploitation of children in prostitution, online sexual exploitation, in order to afford substantive protection to all children, including those belonging to ethnic minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Portugal welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR and the country's efforts to implement the accepted UPR recommendations. We welcome the progress on the protection of the rights of the child and promotion of gender equality, as well as the 2 visits by UN special procedures. Portugal recommends that LAO PDR: 1. Abolish the death penalty. 2. Prevent and combat arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, torture and other ill treatments, in particular against members of the Hmong community. Initiate impartial and independent investigations of such acts, and ratify the UN Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. 3. Scale up the investment and improve the availability and quality of services in rural and remote areas, in particular access to education and health, including sexual and reproductive health, addressing the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women, girls and members of ethnic minorities. And 4. Prohibit child labor according to international norms and standards, including by setting the minimum age for employment at 14 years without exception, and take specific measures to ensure and stimulate that all children, including girls, attend school, in particular in rural and remote areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we'd like to welcome the delegation of LAO PDR and thank them for the presentation of their report. We have taken note with appreciation of the policy and legislative measures taken to implement recommendations accepted in the previous UPR, as well as the 2015-2020 plan to amend legislation so as to incorporate ratified treaties, including human rights treaties. We have also taken note of the effort to strengthen existing national institutions and establish new machinery to comply with the country's treaty obligations. In order to support Laos' efforts to promote and protect human rights, we'd like to make the following recommendations: continue to take necessary measures for all children to have equal access to quality education, especially those living in rural and remote areas. 2. To intensify efforts to enhance enhance bilateral, regional and international cooperation to combat trafficking in persons, and finally to develop a national policy to enable people in rural areas to benefit from economic programs aimed at reducing poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Korea extends a warm welcome to the delegation of LAO PDR to its third cycle of the UPR. One of the recommendations Korea put forth in the second cycle concerned the elimination of all forms of discrimination against and ensuring greater empowerment, representation, and advancement of women. In this light, we are pleased to note the marked progress LAO PDR has made in recent years in the field of gender equality, as demonstrated by its Global Gender Gap Index jumping from the world's 60th in 2013 to the 26th in 2018. We are also encouraged by the ongoing efforts in poverty reduction, judicial reforms, and improving access to health and education through the National Social Economic Development Plan and the Legal Sector Master Plan. In a constructive spirit, we offer the following recommendations today. 1. Consider establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with the Paris Principles. 2. Continue the efforts to ensure the protection of women and children victims of trafficking, including by providing them with improved access to shelters. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Mr. President, we welcome the delegation from Laos and we thank them for the report. We support the efforts to implement the recommendations from the second round of the UPR. We note with satisfaction the reforms of the judicial and administrative systems as a part of the implementation of the general plan to ensure the rule of law by 2020. We recommend continuing to take targeted steps to improve national legislation, including observing human rights and freedoms. We would like to note particularly the active participation by Lao in regional cooperation in protecting human rights. We positively assess the results of the February 2016 session held in Vientiane and chaired by Laos of the 20th session of the Intergovernmental Commission of ASEAN on Human Rights. As a part of the recommendations from the second round of the UPR, we note major positive steps taken by Laos, protecting and promoting the rights of women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and other vulnerable population groups.
Thank you. Time is up. Next speaker is Senegal. Absent. We move to another the next speaker, Serbia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Serbia welcomes the delegation of LAO and thanks for the UPR national report presented. Serbia welcomes the effort invested and measures taken on improvement of the human rights in general. In particular, we commend the measures taken and on raising the awareness of the UN human rights standards and relevant training courses organized. In spirit of a constructive dialogue, we would like to recommend to LAO to ratify the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. We wish Lao a successful review process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Singapore.
Singapore warmly welcomes the Lao delegation and acknowledges the government's efforts since its last review to promote and protect the rights of its people. We commend the LAO PDR's sustained efforts to provide for the education of children, in particular efforts to improve educational infrastructure in rural areas and to allocate 17% of its annual GDP to the education sector. Singapore recommends that to address the teachers' shortage, the government consider working where appropriate with bilateral partners and the relevant UN agencies such as UNICEF to attract and train volunteer teachers. We also commend the government's ongoing poverty reduction efforts, including the Poverty Reduction Fund Phase 3, which has decreased poverty in villages by 16.97%. Singapore recommends that the government continue to develop policies and legislation for inclusive growth and poverty reduction. Finally, Singapore remains concerned about the disappearance of Mr. Sombath Somphong since 2012 and urges the Lao government to seriously investigate and resolve the case in an expeditious manner and to bring much needed relief to Sombath's family. Singapore supports the LAO PDR's development goals and is committed to continuing our strong technical cooperation. As a close neighbour and fellow ASEAN member, Singapore wishes the LAO PDR every success in its efforts to achieve its Vision 2030 and graduate from LDC status in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia thanks the distinguished delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic for their presentation today and for their dedication to the UPR process. My delegation wishes to repeat the recommendation we made in the second cycle and recommend to consider acceding to or ratifying the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. Slovenia attaches great importance to human rights education and thus welcomes Laos' engagement in awareness raising and human rights training for state officials and general public. We took note that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a handbook on basic human rights information and distributed them to officials and law enforcement officers, members of the National Assembly, judicial officers, lawyers and law students. While we take note that over the last few years the LAO PDR has taken a number of steps to address the root causes of human trafficking, including awareness-raising campaigns and on the danger of human trafficking, we encourage LAO PDR to step up its efforts to investigate and punish individuals who exploited women and girls in prostitution and provide adequate assistance to them. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Solomon Islands warmly welcome the delegation of LAO PDR and thank the delegation for the presentation of its national report. Solomon Islands congratulate Laos for the progress it made to address its human rights commitment. In constructive spirit, Solomon Islands make the following recommendations. 1. Review and amend Decree 315 to ensure that administrative procedures for religious groups are not arbitrary, vague, and discriminatory, and to eliminate the wide latitude local officials have to discriminate against and persecute religious minorities. 2. Allow all religious communities to meet and conduct activities freely regardless of whether they are incorporated or registered. 3. Introduce a mechanism to monitor and regulate local officials, especially in rural areas, to ensure they conform with human rights standards and do not arbitrarily and discriminatorily target Christians and other religious minorities. Solomon Islands wishes the delegation of LAO PDR a successful UPR.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Spain.
Thank you, Vice President. Spain extends a warm welcome to the LAO PDR. We welcome their commitment and respectfully we make the following recommendations. 1. That you establish a unified national human rights institution with sufficient resources in line with the Paris Principles as part of progress made in order to strengthen the normative framework for the rights of the child. We recommend 2. That you approve an integral national strategy which has a specific budget line and appropriate oversight. 3. That you guarantee strict application of the law on family to prohibit early marriage and polygamy, particularly in the rural and ethnic communities. 4. Establish an official moratorium when it comes to the application of the death penalty as a first step to the definitive abolition of the death penalty, modifying the criminal code to reduce the number of offences for which one can impose the capital sentence. Given the increase of detentions and attacks against human rights defenders, you need to ensure freedom of movement as well as freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Many thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of the LAO PDR and appreciates the detailed presentation made to the Council. Sri Lanka welcomes the amendments made to the Constitution of the LAO PDR since the last reporting cycle, which now stipulates that the state acknowledges, respects, protects and guarantees fundamental rights of citizens in accordance with the law. It is also encouraging to note that a number of new laws have been enacted that codifies the penal code, civil code, law on state compensation, law on treaties and international agreements, among others. It is noted that the LAO PDR has streamlined the provisions of the international treaties which it is party to, including human rights treaties, into its domestic law. We take note of the efforts taken to combat trafficking, including the implementation of the National Plan on Anti-Trafficking in Persons, Phase 2 for 2016-2020, with allocated national budget and assigning the National Steering Committee on Anti-Human Trafficking as the main implementing agency. In a constructive spirit, Sri Lanka recommends that the LAO PDR 1.
ratifies the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. 2. Considers accession to the optional protocol on the Convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment.
Thank you very much. Time is up. Next speaker is Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice President, Switzerland welcomes the delegation from LAO PDR. We're very concerned at reports of cases of enforced disappearances. We deplore the absence of progress on the case of Sombath Somphone. We recommend to the government that they ratify the International Convention against enforced disappearances and to ensure that it is implemented. Switzerland is concerned at restrictions on human rights in Laos, particularly right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. We recommend to the government that you put an end to the arrests of those people who are peacefully expressing their opinions. Switzerland would also recommend that LAO PDR manages as best they can any infrastructure project, including dams, and ensuring that they're safe in order to avoid enforced displacement, including the concerned communities in the decision-making process, and if there is an avoidable displacement, that you guarantee effective compensation and relocation programs in line with international standards. And finally, we welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, as well as efforts made to reduce poverty in the country. We encourage LAO PDR to draw inspiration from this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
سيد نائب الرئيس شكرا. يرحب وفد الجمهورية العربية السورية بوفد جمهورية لاو الديمقراطية الشعبية.
We would like to extend a warm welcome to LAO PDR, and we'd like to also thank them for submitting their national report. We also welcome efforts made as regards implementing the recommendations of the second cycle, namely improving living standards and the gradual improvement under their 10-year program regarding the 2016-2027, as well as your 5-year plan on economic progress. We recommend the following: strengthen your justice system, as well as those who enforce the law, as well as law students' capabilities. Strengthen social services, particularly in the far-flung regions, and improve your public health service in villages as well as your towns and cities. Every success.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Thailand.
Vice President, Thailand welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR and the progress made towards the LAO PDR's graduation for the LDC status by 2024. Thailand applauds the achievements promoting gender equality as reflected by the high ranking of LAO PDR in the Global Gender Gap Index. Thailand commends the government's efforts that have contributed to the increase in the literacy and school enrollment rates. Thailand recommends the following. First, continue with efforts to further provide training and information on human rights standards to government officials and judges, as well as human rights education to business, students and the general public. Second, incorporate the rights of women, children, people with disabilities and other relevant groups into its 9th National Socio-Economic Development Plan, and consider taking integrated approaches in the implementation of the SDGs and human rights policies where applicable. As a neighboring country and fellow ASEAN member, Thailand is ready to cooperate closely and exchange lessons learned and good practice with the LAO PDR. We wish the LAO PDR every success in the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste welcomed the delegation of the Laos People's Democratic Republic to the 3rd cycles of the Universal Periodic Review and congratulate the country on the comprehensive report presented. Timor-Leste welcomed the measure taken by Laos to increase access to education and improve illiteracy and enrollment rates among women and girls, which was reduced in the raising of the literacy rate to 85% in 2019. Furthermore, the delegation notes with appreciation the adoption of the National Action Plan on the prevention and elimination of violence against women and children for 2014 and 2020. Despite all of the progress made, Timor-Leste wishes to put the following recommendation to the delegation of Laos for each consideration. that Laos allocate financial and human resources to implement the national plan of action on persons with disability, that Laos increase in effort to prevent child and sexual exploitation, that Laos adopts comprehensive strategy to eliminate discrimination against children and marginalized or vulnerable situations. We wish our good friend of Laos a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Tunisia. You have the floor.
شكرا سيدنا نائب الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي.
Thank you, Vice President. My delegation would like to welcome the LAO delegation, whom we thank for the presentation of the national report. We appreciate the legislation adopted in order to improve the human rights situation, this through the ratification of a number of international conventions and the launching of new programs and adoption of national laws, such as the law on fighting gender-based violence. We present in a positive mode the following recommendations: to envisage the creation of an independent national human rights institution in line with the Paris principles. Second, to continue efforts to ensure gender equality and to build an environment that fosters the role of women. Third, to foster efforts to protect children from all forms of violence. We wish every success to Laos following this cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Turkmenistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Extending our warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR at the UPR Working Group session, we thank for the comprehensive update to deliver today on human rights in Laos. We welcome ambitious objectives and efforts of the Laotian government to become an upper middle income country by 2030 through carrying out the state programs, including the Strategic Development Plan for 2016 and 2025, the Vision 2030, and 8th National Socio-Economic Development Plan. Acknowledging the adoption of the lawmaking and amending plan for 2015 and 2020 to integrate and implement the obligations and aspirations from the international treaties to which the Laos is party to. Along with that, we would like to submit the following recommendations. 1. To further continue its awareness raising and training activities on human rights for the state officials and the general public to raise the legal awareness across the country. 2. To strengthen its ongoing process to improve the justice sector, to build good governance and public administration through its legal sector master plan for rule of law for 2009 and 2020. In conclusion, Turkmenistan wishes the government of LAO PDR a successful UPR review at its third cycle. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bunket Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the second time. Now I want to give the floor to 4 Lao speakers as follows. The first on SCSO, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Second speaker on National Human Rights Institution, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The third, political role for women, for Women Federation. And the last one, land management for National Assembly. So you have the floor starting from CSO, Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the head of the delegation, I'd like to respond to the concerns and suggestions made by few member states on the issue related to freedom of association. The Lao government has no restriction nor denies any right to establish or to join an association. As mentioned by our head of delegations, currently there are 163 associations and 25 foundations have been officially registered with Ministry of Home Affairs since the adoption of the Amendment Decree 238/PM. The adoption of the mentioned decree on association and foundations aim to make it clear on the role and responsibility of relevant authority and ministry of concern, which have the field of competence related to the activity or proposal of association to share the responsibility to implement activity or the work on the ground. It is to ensure that all activity conducted by NPA or CSOs in the countries are in line with national law and legislation, as well as to complement the government efforts in realizing our national socio-economic development plan and response to the real need of the people and the nations on the national social development efforts. In practice, since the new regulation or the degrees have been adopted, some challenges does exist due to the limitation of understanding on the provision of the degree and the regulation related to or requirements for stipulated therein. That's often often delay the approval process by saying that the government understands that more work needs to be done. In reality, most of project and activity conducted by local NPA or CSO were funded by external sources. Therefore, Article 55 of the Decree 238/PM and its specific guidelines stipulated clearly that legislation NPA or CSO can receive financial or technical support from the individual or organizations. They must proceed accordingly to the provision of the said article and its specific guidelines. This is to ensure transparency and conformity with existing law and regulation. In this connection, Decree 238/PM amended in 2017 remain relevant and practical. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I would like to inform you with regard to women participation in political and public life. In recent years, there has been an increase in the proportion of women in National Assembly and in the judiciary, and the continued commitment of the Lao government to increase women participation in political decision-making, as evident through a number of policy measures taken to encourage their participation. The strongest example of this is the fact that 27.5% of National Assembly members are women. According to the National Combined 8/9 Periodic Report on the implementation of CEDAW in the LAO PDR, submitted to the CEDAW Committee in 2007, 10.7% of the cabinet ministers are female, 10.6% of deputy ministers are female, and 16.2% of director general are female, and 12.8% of the ambassador and consul general are female. The government goal was to have female at least 15% in such decision-making position and 30% of women in the National Assembly. The presence of women in the national level position, however, is not resulting in an increase in women in leadership at the province and local level. The government of the LAO PDR maintained its commitment to increase women leadership and public participation under the 8th NSDDP and reaffirmed its commitment to endorse and implement by 2025 a plan of action to promote women participation in political and public life in LAO PDR as part of the 9th National Socio-Economic Development Plan. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, I would like to address concern expressed by some delegates on land rights as follows. Land is under the ownership of the national community. Land rights is guaranteed by the Constitution and land law. The state ensures land use right by allocating land to individuals, organizations for use, transfer, and inheritance as provided by the law. The LAO PDR pursues a policy of openness and market-oriented economy, promoting diversified investment in economic investment, while ensuring development of economy and the use of natural resources are sustainable, green-oriented, and must be complemented by social and environmental responsibility. In order to ensure development in this direction, LAO PDR has adopted a number of legal instruments to ensure sustainable implementation of natural resource management and environmental management and public participation in development. It is important to note that the permission for land concession for development project in the area of agriculture, industry, transportation, and other fields in the LAO PDR requires environmental and social impact assessment in accordance with the law and standards. In the implementation process, committees represented by representatives from various organizations will be established to conduct environmental and social impact assessment, to seek public opinion and consultation with the people who may be affected through meetings at the village level, district level, and provincial level, and at all levels required, in order to ensure the transparency of the consultation process. In the case that it is required for relocation of people from the project area, the state provides new land area for resettlement and implements compensation policy based on the degree on compensation, with efforts to improve living conditions of the people, such as access to electricity, clean water, school, healthcare, employment, and other services. The established committee have also the role in monitoring the implementation of the project in each period. From 2015 to 2019, investment projects relating to land leasing and concession have been reviewed to ensure that the implementation of the project are in accordance with the laws and regulations of the LAO PDR. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, to give me an opportunity to make comments on the issue of the independent national human rights institution as raised by some delegation as follows. During the past time, we have researched and studied the possibility of establishing a national mechanism or institution for protection and promotion of human rights that would be suited to the realities, conditions, and social demands of the country. The said organization would have the mandate to monitor the implementation of human rights as well as other obligations under treaties that the LAO PDR is party to. To this end, the LAO PDR has studied many models from other countries that have established their national human rights institutions. The result of the study concludes that with the current circumstances, there is a stronger need for us to further strengthen the legal framework and existing mechanism rather than creating a new one. The said mechanism include in the LAO PDR the National Committee on Human Rights, the National Commission for the Advancement of Women, Mother and Children, and the National Committee for Elderly and Persons with Disability. Furthermore, we do have the law on complaint and petition that provide the rights for citizens and organizations to be able to file their complaint to the relevant organization to the purpose or request for remedy or any act of individual or decision made by a particular organization that might be deemed as a violation of law, injustice to the collective interest, to the state or group, or the rights of individual. The relevant organization here mean the government, the local authorities, investigation organization, the Office of People's Prosecutor, the People Court, as well as the Standing Committee of the National Assembly, all have the duty and bound by the law to inspect and provide remedy for complaint and petition from its citizen, legal person or organization. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. President, I have exhausted my list speaker. I give back my microphone.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Now we will revert to the interactive dialogue. Next on the list is Ukraine. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Ukraine thanks the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic for its detailed presentation of the national report. Ukraine recognizes steps taken by the government of Laos to ensure human rights of its citizens since the last UPR cycle. Yet, we are concerned over information about shrinking space for civil society in the country. In particular, the reports of restrictions of the rights to freedom of expression, assembly and association, as well as reported practice of arbitrary detention and incidents of torture. Ukraine recommends to Laos to 1. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of all persons from enforced disappearance without reservations. 2. Amend national legislation to ensure that it is fully consistent with Laos's international human rights obligations and, in particular, to provide for fair trials and freedom from torture and arbitrary detention. 3. Establish an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 4. Issue a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom recognises progress in the Lao People's Democratic Republic, including on education and healthcare. The UK welcomes increasing infrastructure and development in Laos, but remains concerned about projects resulting in forced land appropriation. The UK also welcomes Laos' acceptance of recommendations that detained persons be treated humanely, but remains concerned that allegations of torture are common and not properly investigated. The UK is also concerned about restrictions on freedom of expression and foreign news agencies. We urge the government to promote and protect freedom of expression for all. We recommend 1. Develop and implement a national action plan on human trafficking and modern slavery, using this as a framework to evaluate progress on combating modern slavery and allocate funded budgets to the national action plan. 2. Repeal all legislation inhibiting freedom of opinion and expression that are not compatible with Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And 3. Undertake impartial, thorough and transparent investigations into all enforced disappearances, including Sombath, Somphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is United States of America.
The United States welcomes the Lao delegation to the UPR Working Group. We recommend that Laos, 1, undertake domestic independent investigations into the disappearances and deaths of democracy and human rights activists. 2, amend Decree 238 and its associated amendments to align it with Laos's international human rights obligations and commitments, including by eliminating the following: burdensome registration requirements, arbitrary curtailment of activities and finances of associations, criminalization of unregistered associations, and the government's harassment of their members, and the ability to arbitrarily dissolve non-profit associations without the right of appeal. 3, bring the criminal code in line with obligations under the ICCPR and immediately release individuals whose arrest and detention under these provisions restricted the legitimate exercise of their rights to freedom of opinion and expression. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Laos, particularly severe restrictions on fundamental freedoms that deprive the country's citizens of an opportunity to exercise basic rights and deprive the government of an opportunity to engage meaningfully with its citizenry. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Uruguay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Vice President. The State of Uruguay recognizes the efforts made by Laos in the area of the rights of the child by incorporating the provisions of the Convention of the Rights of the Child into your national legislation. In order to step up efforts in the area of human rights, we recommend the following. First of all, that you prohibit all form of corporal punishment on children in all settings. 2, that you enhance efforts to implement programs and policies to ensure that women and girls can have access throughout your territory to sexual and reproductive health services. 3, that you guarantee freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and association, as well as the freedom of religion and belief, in line with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Finally, Uruguay would also recommend 4, that you consider ratifying the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, and 5thly, that you step up efforts to ratify the second optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We encourage Laos to continue with their reforms in order to ensure the protection of human rights for your entire population, particularly minorities, migrant population, as well as women, and we wish every success in your review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Uzbekistan.
Благодарю, господин председатель.
Thank you, President. We have read carefully the national report of Lao under the UPR, and we also express our gratitude to the delegation for presenting it. We would like to welcome the ongoing processes of institutional, political and socio-economic reform in the country. This includes the most recent amendments to the Constitution, which greatly improve the protections and guarantees for the main rights and freedoms of citizens. We recommend, first, to continue to integrate international norms in the area of human rights into national legislation. Second, to ensure that the national targeted programs for development are effectively implemented to boost the living conditions of the population. In conclusion, we would like to wish every success to the government of Lao in protecting and promoting human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Venezuela. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. We extend warm greetings to the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR. We appreciate the compliance given so far to UPR recommendations. We're happy to see the wise policies promoted by your government in the area of education, health and poverty reduction. Also, effective protection is being given to families, particularly the most vulnerable. The country attaches a great deal of importance to poverty reduction, the aim being to graduate from LDC status by 2024 and achieve the SDGs. By 2018, the poverty rate had dropped by 15.5% in certain districts. The following recommendations. 1. With the support of international cooperation, you could step up your wise efforts in investing in health, education and poverty reduction. 2. That you continue with ensuring full and free access to primary and secondary education for all children. And 3. Strengthen the national health system to reduce maternal and child mortality. We wish you every success in your UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Vietnam.
President, Vietnam warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for the presentation of the national report. Vietnam takes a good note of Laos' strong efforts in improving its legislation and policies on human rights, including the adoption of 43 new laws and 31 amendments, and notably the law apps on mobile phones to facilitate the access to and the participation in drafting new laws. Vietnam also commends Laos for its impressive economic development and poverty reduction, which in turn would help raising the living standard of the Laos people and better ensuring their human rights. Vietnam recommends the following. 1. Continue efforts in socio-economic development and poverty eradication to further facilitate the enjoyment of human rights of its people. 2. Allocate adequate resources to provide affordable and quality basic medical services to its people. 3. Strengthen measures to further promote the right to education, especially to ensure sufficient teachers and school facilities in remote areas. As a close neighbor and fellow ASEAN member, Vietnam wishes Laos a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to welcome the head of the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and we greatly appreciate their detailed presentation of the report, which mentions the progress achieved in the field of human rights. The government has dealt positively with these the provisions of treaty bodies and has thus amended its legislation to bring it in line with these treaties, including, of course, the Convention Against Torture, Trafficking, Discrimination based on ethnic origin, and discrimination against women as well as persons with disabilities. Lao has also taken measures to improve the situation of women and children. We commend Lao on its achievements and recommend that it continue to implement its development strategy in order to raise the living standards of its population and to provide it with the necessary services, especially in the rural areas. Finally, we wish Lao a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Zambia.
Thank you, Vice President. Zambia welcomes the delegation of the LAO PDR to the third cycle of the UPR working group and thank them for the comprehensive report and update provided. We commend the LAO PDR for having implemented 116 recommendations she supported during the second cycle. We welcome the adoption of the National Action Plan on the Prevention and Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children 2014-2020. In the spirit of a constructive dialogue, Zambia wishes to recommend to the LAO PDR the following. 1, to begin the process of establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with the PARI principles. 2, to ensure that corporal punishment against children having light was explicitly prohibited in the penal code. 3, to redouble the efforts to improve conditions of detention centers in accordance with the Convention, the Covenant and the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners. We wish the delegation of the LAO PDR a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Afghanistan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Afghanistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR to this meeting and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We acknowledge the progress made in strengthening the legal and policy framework in support of the human rights and the significant progress in decreasing illiteracy and gender disparity. However, concern remains on issues such as pressure over the media and limitations on the practice of the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. With the aim to further strengthen the protection and promotion of human rights in the country, we wish to make the following recommendations. 1, consider establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with Paris principles. 2, redouble its efforts to reduce maternal mortality and implement programs aimed at reducing child mortality and morbidity. 3, ensure that refugees and asylum seekers are protected and any attacks on them are subject to prompt, thorough and independent investigations. Finally, Afghanistan wishes to allow every success in the current cycle of the UPR. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Algeria.
Vice President.
Thank you, Vice President. We would like to warmly welcome the delegation from LAO PDR and thank them for presenting their third national report under the UPR. My country welcomes the measures taken by the People's Democratic Republic of Laos to improve access to education and increase the literacy rate, as well as ensure schooling for women and girls. Algeria also commends progress achieved to strengthen the legal and political framework on the rights of the child and incorporating the provisions into national legislation from the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have the following recommendations. First, to effectively implement programs to reduce child mortality and morbidity levels, notably by boosting the qualifications of midwives and establishing quality standards for maternal and neonatal care. Second, to ensure that all girls and all women, in particular those living in rural and remote areas, have access to education, eliminating discriminatory stereotypes which hinder schooling for girls, and engaging in awareness raising for parents and local officials on the importance of education for women.
Time is up. Next speaker is Argentina.
We'd like to welcome the delegation of LAO PDR and we'd like to thank them for the presentation of their report. We'd congratulate LAO PDR for the cooperation that they have with the international community and with international organizations, inter alia, OHCHR and its regional office, with a view to implementing those recommendations accepted in their prior UPR. Furthermore, the delegation of Argentina would like to make the following recommendations. 1, that they take the necessary measures to repeal the death penalty from their national legislation, and 2, that you adopt all measures to define the crime of enforced disappearance in your national legislation so as to be able to investigate and punish the perpetrators of such acts. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Armenia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Armenia welcomes the delegation of the LAO People's Democratic Republic to the UPR. We took note that the government declared its attachment and special attention to the promotion and protection of human rights of all the LAO people, since its national motto is to build a state that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. We were pleased to note that the government adopted National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care 2016-2025. We recommend it to continue with its efforts towards combating
combating infant, child and maternal mortality and malnutrition rates. We also note of the work the LAO PDR has done in the direction of the adoption and implementation of the human rights treaties. We recommend and encourage it to continue it by ratification and implementation of the international human rights instruments in collaboration with OHCHR and other UN bodies. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia recommends that LAO 1 amend laws that restrict freedom of expression, assembly and association to comply with international human rights law. 2. Facilitate a supportive environment to better enable civil society organisations to operate. 3. Conduct independent, impartial and transparent investigations into all alleged cases of enforced disappearance, including that of Sombat Sompon, ensuring family members are regularly informed of any progress. 4. Establish a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. Australia commends LAO for its commitment to improving social and economic rights and for increasing engagement with the Human Rights Council Special Procedures Mandate holders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Azerbaijan.
Mr. Vice President, Azerbaijan welcomes the delegation of the LAO PDR and thanks the delegation for the presentation of its national report today. We welcome the increased level of cooperation of the LAO PDR with the treaty bodies and special procedures of the United Nations. We take positive note of the measures taken by the government aimed at building enabling environment for enjoyment of all human rights. Azerbaijan offers the following recommendations to the LAO PDR. First, continue adopting and implementing national plans to empower women in all spheres of life. Second, take preventive and awareness-raising measures in order to further develop the fight against human trafficking. Third, continue implementing its poverty reduction efforts across all the country, in particular in rural areas. We wish the delegation of the LAO PDR a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bangladesh. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bangladesh welcomes the distinguished delegation of LAO PDR to the third cycle of UPR. We take positive note of LAO PDR's initiatives to amend and adopt several laws and policies, particularly to amend the Constitution in order to respect, protect and guarantee the human rights. It is encouraging to see newly adopted first ever penal code, civil code, law on estate compensation, law on treaties and international agreements. We appreciate continuing economic growth and recent uplifting of people's living conditions, accelerating the country's progress to graduation from LDC group by 2024. We applaud LAO PDR's submission of national reports on ICCPR, CEDAW, CRC and CAPD in recent years. Bangladesh recommends LAO PDR to continue efforts in international community support and assistance in promoting and protecting human rights, particularly the economic, social and cultural rights of its people. Continuous effort to eradicate poverty and promote access to education for all citizens. We wish to LAO PDR a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Belarus.
Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the LAO delegation and we thank them for presenting the national report. We note with satisfaction the long list of international commitments of the country in the area of human rights, a great deal of work done to improve legislation and ambitious plans for the future in this area, the adoption of a number of national strategies, including in sustainable development, and the protection of motherhood and the rights of children. With respect to strengthening national mechanisms of human rights and activating and intensifying cooperation on international rights protection mechanisms, we would like to make the following recommendations: to increase future efforts to combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children, including by improving law enforcement practices with a view to bringing to justice and punishing the perpetrators, as well as by providing victims of trafficking with protection and rehabilitation. We wish them every success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belgium thanks the delegation of Laos for its presentation and commends the government for its cooperation with 2 UN Special Rapporteurs. My country is convinced, however, that more progress can be achieved in line with the core international human rights treaties. Belgium therefore recommends the government to 1. Ensure that any restrictions on the exercise of the freedom of expression and peaceful assembly comply with the requirements of Articles 19 and 21 of the ICCPR. 2. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance and ensure its effective implementation. And lastly, as a strong opponent of the death penalty, Belgium recommends the government to ratify the second optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Benin.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Vice President. The Benin delegation would like to warmly welcome the delegation from the LAO PDR. We congratulate them upon the presentation of their third national report. We note with satisfaction that the country has adopted, since its last UPR cycle, a number of legislative and institutional reforms in favor of international instruments, notably in the area of human rights, such as the first criminal and civil codes, the law on compensation by the state, and the law on treaties and international agreements. We also welcome the adoption by that country during the last period of the National Strategy for Women and Children, the Plan of National Action for Women and Children, and the Plan of Action on the national level for the prevention and eradication of violence against women and children. We welcome the progress in the country, and we recommend continuing this activity and new initiatives for strengthening the Plan of Action for people with disabilities. We wish them every success. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bhutan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation thanks the government of Laos for the comprehensive report on the implementation status of the recommendations from the second cycle. Adoption of as many as 42 new laws and amendment of existing laws, including Constitution, is noteworthy, as is the effort in streamlining the domestic laws with the international treaties. We also commend Laos for raising awareness through distribution of brochures on human rights and for conducting training on human rights for the general public and state officials, including the law enforcement authorities, which would enable greater understanding and respect for human rights. We congratulate Laos for the excellent progress made in promoting and protecting the human rights of women and children, and therefore we recommend Laos to continue these measures of promoting and protecting rights of women and children, including raising awareness and training. Bhutan also recommends Laos to continue its poverty reduction efforts and effectively implement the poverty reduction plans and programs. Through these concerted development efforts, we wish Laos the very best in achieving LDC graduation soon. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Brazil welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR to the third cycle of the UPR and presents the following two recommendations. 1, to consider an official moratorium on the death penalty as a first step towards the abolition of capital punishment. And 2, to consider ratifying the ILO Convention number 105 on the abolition of forced labor. Brazil takes note with appreciation the preliminary results from the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children, especially regarding the enhanced birth registration and lower rates of mortality and malnutrition among children under 5 years old. We encourage LAO to continue to implement measures to reduce maternal mortality. We commend the country for the preparation of the new plan of action dedicated to people with disabilities and encourage investments in inclusive education. Brazil takes this opportunity to encourage LAO to also guarantee the free and full exercise of freedom of religion and to protect Christians against any form of persecution based on their religion, as well as to punish perpetrators. We share the views from the LAO PDR that the international cooperation can play a role in the implementation of voluntary human rights pledges and recommendations supported during the UPR process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Brunei Darussalam. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Brunei Darussalam warmly welcomes the delegation of the LAO People's Democratic Republic to Geneva and thanks them for sharing the latest human rights situation in their country. Brunei Darussalam commends the government of LAO PDR's adoptions of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care and the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children. Brunei Darussalam is pleased to note that LAO PDR has introduced a mandatory free education system up to lower secondary education. Brunei Darussalam further congratulates the LAO PDR government efforts in providing allowances to students from poor families. Therefore, Brunei Darussalam proposes two recommendations. One, to ensure the full and effective implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care, and the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children. And two, to continue efforts to promote and protect the rights of children to education. Mr. Vice President, Brunei Darussalam wishes our fellow member of ASEAN, LAO PDR, a successful conclusion to its third UPR session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Bulgaria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bulgaria welcomes the delegation of LAO People's Democratic Republic. We appreciate the progress made by the state in strengthening the legal and policy framework related to children's and women's rights, and welcome the adoption of the National Strategy for Mothers and Children, as well as the establishment of the National Commission for the Advancement of Women, Mothers and Children. We also acknowledge that LAO has integrated the principle of the best interest of the child into laws in several key sectors, such as health, education and justice. We are of the view that more attention and further effort shall be exerted for strengthening of child protection, including protection of children at risk. Additional institutional and human resources for child care are needed, particularly for family support and community-based child protection services. Our recommendations: first, to take measures to further develop a comprehensive national policy and strategy for child protection with the aim to eliminate discrimination against children in marginalized or vulnerable situations, including girls. And second, consider developing an efficient system for identifying and addressing the individual support needs of children with disabilities. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Cambodia.
Mr. Vice President, Cambodia would like to congratulate LAO PDR's substantial progress and achievements in its second UPR cycle. Cambodia applauds LAO's realization of an impressive economic growth and considerable improvement in the living condition of the people over the past 5 years. Cambodia welcomes the priority that LAO PDR attached to the adoption of legislations seeking to strengthen the anti-corruption endeavors. Cambodia commends LAO's extensive effort to engage in the ASEAN and UN human rights mechanism as well as the UN special procedures with a view to enhancing the promotion and protection of human rights. In a constructive spirit, Cambodia would like to put forward two recommendations. First, to intensify the ongoing effort toward inclusive economic growth, further poverty reductions, and increase investment in rural health care services. Second, enhance endeavor to increase women participation in public affairs and economic development. Finally, I wish the delegation of LAO PDR every success in this exercise. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Canada.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Vice President. Canada recognizes the positive engagement of the government of Laos with the UN mechanisms, particularly the completion of national reviews pursuant to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the ICCPR. Canada would recommend that LAO PDR first of all, conducts credible and in-depth investigations into all alleged cases of enforced disappearance, including the disappearance of Sombath Somphone and other human rights defenders. Two, that you fully acquit yourself of the obligations incumbent on you pursuant to the ICCPR, namely respecting and guaranteeing freedom of the right to expression. Three, that you abolish the death penalty. And four, that you take measures to increase the representation of women in politics, particularly applying a 25% quota for the representation of women at all levels of government. Canada encourages the government to reconsider the burdensome administrative provisions of Decree 238, which limits civil society in the exercise of their activities. We wish every success to the delegation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Chile. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Many thanks, Vice President. We'd like to thank the delegation of LAO UPR for the submission of their national report. We're happy to see the progress made since the previous UPR cycle, particularly in incorporation of this recognition to respect, promote and guarantee human rights in the 2015 Constitution. Also, we'd like to highlight the development of public policies such as your National Action Plan to prevent and eliminate violence against women and children. We'd also congratulate you on the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, as well as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In order to continue strengthening the promotion of human rights, we'd like to recommend the following. First of all, that you deploy efforts to establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles, and two, that you establish legislation to effectively criminalize child marriage and adopt measures to eliminate such a practice. And three, that you ratify the International Convention Against Enforced Disappearances. We wish your country every success in implementation of this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is China. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the Chinese delegation welcomes the high-level delegation from the LAO PDR to the UPR. We sincerely congratulate Laos on its remarkable achievements in the field of human rights. China commends Laos' energetic efforts to advance economic social development, to improve people's living standards, to promote poverty reduction, to develop education and health services, to protect the rights of women, children and persons with disabilities, and to achieve ethnic harmony. China supports Laos' continued journey on a human rights path that is suitable to its national conditions. China has 3 recommendations to Laos. 1, to further continue economic and social development to reduce the number of people living in poverty. 2nd, to further develop education to strive for universal access to compulsory education. 3rd, to further develop health services, strengthen public health institutions. The Chinese delegation wishes the LAO PDR every success in the UPR. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Egypt. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the delegation of Egypt welcomes the delegation of LAO PDR, congratulates it on its national report and the establishment of a National Committee on the Empowerment of Women and Children and a National Committee on Persons with Disability and Older Persons, together with an Anti-Trafficking Committee. We took note of the efforts deployed by the government to promote the respect of the civil and political rights, freedoms of religion and faith, and elimination of racial discrimination. We offer the following recommendations. First, continue constructive cooperation with the treaty bodies of the Human Rights Council and the Special Procedures Regime. Second, pursue efforts to develop the health sector and comprehensive health care. In closing, we wish all the best for the country. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This was the last speaker on our list. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungket Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments and to make final remarks. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You be the last row speaker for Laos. Now I give the floor to 3 speakers. The first on human trafficking for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, second on religion, Ministry of Home Affairs, and the last one, poverty reduction, Ministry of Agriculture. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I would like to respond to recommendation on trafficking in person issue that some countries have expressed their concerns. The Lao government acknowledged that human trafficking is a serious crime, a violation of fundamental rights and human dignity, especially against women and children. Therefore, the government attached importance in combating, preventing and suppressing human trafficking at national level, with focal emphasis on the victim-central approach in its protection and assistance efforts. In order to have a legal reference in implementing the said task, the National Assembly has adopted the law on human trafficking in the year 2015 and the penal law in the year 2017, which has clearly stipulated the definition on human trafficking, which is in line with the protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in person, especially women and children, supplementing to the United Nations Convention Against
transnational organized crime, and the ASEAN Convention against trafficking in person, especially women and children, all of which the LAO PDR is the party. The LAO PDR has completed the implementation of each phase of the National Action Plan on the anti-trafficking in person for the period of the year 2016 up to the year 2020, and is now the process of considering the third action plan for the year 2021 up to the year 25 period. The new plan includes the further emphasis on the improving the policy, law, and international cooperation, preventive measure, prosecution of the trafficker, and victim rescue and assistance, as well as state budget allocation along with the international cooperation campaign for the anti-trafficking task. In the effort to tackle the root cause of the trafficking in person, the government has adopted the preventive and suppressive measures as the main approach, aimed at raising awareness on the danger of human trafficking to the society, especially toward the women and children. Also create the better understanding on the risk of falling victim for the trafficking at the increase exponentially in the case of illegal migrant workers. The campaigns include the publicizing and the raising awareness on the population living in the border area and all the villages considered as the high risk across the country. The publication include the various media such as the radio and the television broadcast, pamphlets, short film and drama, and other participatory activities. Furthermore, training sessions were organized for the members of the mass media and the printing press in order to enhance the advertisement capacity and effectiveness in the disseminating on the danger of the human trafficking and how to cross the border safety legally. Thank you, Mr. President.
เรียนท่านรองประธานข้าพเจ้าขอมีความเห็นเพิ่มเติมต่อปัญหาการเชื่อถือศาสนาดังนี้โดยสืบต่ออ้างอิงเนื้อในของ
On religion and belief as follows. Pursuant to the national report, I would like to reiterate that Lao citizens without discrimination have freedom and religion or belief. The Constitution particularly guarantees the right to believe or not to believe in religion. The state has an obligation to respect the said rights of citizens and to protect the Buddhist activities as well as the activities of other religions that have been lawfully registered. In order to implement those provisions preventing individuals or groups from coercing, whether directly or indirectly, and prohibits all acts of division and discrimination among ethnic groups. And we have Decree 315 to protect religious activities, especially on equality and protection and promotion of religion in the LAO PDR. At the moment, the relevant sectors, for instance, the various organizations are further disseminating the decree for relevant officials from central to local level to ensure awareness and correct understanding and uniform implementation of the decree. Each dissemination campaign is participated representatives from religious leaders and a number of general public attendants. Thank you.
Mr. President, I would like to clarify more on the poverty reduction, which is the priority of the national agenda of the Lao government. Eliminating all barrier to poverty reduction, the LAO PDR has translated SDG 1 into its national socio-economic development plan under the 2030 vision targeting that the mass poverty should be eradicated, people settlement stabilized and income secure, with accessibility to quality basic services, rural and urban gap reduced, assuring the sustainable rural development, paving the road to the gradual industrialization and modernization of the country. By 2020, the poverty rate should be reduced down to less than 10% and then 5% in 2025, accordingly to the national criteria. In this regard, concrete projects have been designed and the national criteria and indicator adopted. From 2015 up to now, $420 million, including the government budget of 17% and the bank credit 50%, have been allocated to the poverty reduction project, most particularly in the remote rural area. The strong growth made the LAO PDR GNI per capita lift to $260 in 2018, and enabled it to move up to a lower middle income country. And 2 of the 3 criteria of pre-eligibility requirement for lifting from the LDC achieved. Significant progress in poverty reduction has also been made, most particularly during the last 3 years. 11,725 families have been climbed up from the poverty, reducing the poor family percentage down to less than 10% in 2018. And 215 villages out of poverty, with the poor village ratio of 18%. In the same year, 83.36% of the village enjoy the own railroad, and 93.39% of family the electricity. The microcredit services cover 85% of the village nationwide. In addition, the development project have contributed to the job creation and labor upscaling, paving the way for the short-term and long-term development and poverty eradication, and gradually narrowing the development gap between rural and urban areas. Mr. the President, to conclude, the LAO PDR government reaffirmed its target on achieving the SDG by extracting all its existing potential supported by the international assistance and the whole society participation toward keeping on eradicating poverty in a sustainable and inclusive way, graduating from the LDC status and striving for upper medium income country status by 2030. Thank you.
Mr. President, I have again exhausted my list speaker. I give you back my microphone. Yes, before concluding my remarks, Mr. Chairman, President, I want to present some other comments on 2 topics. First, on the rule of law. I think many colleagues from our table suggested that there should be a rule of law state very soon. But you know that the rule of law has been long processed since 18th century. Hopefully by 2020, Laos will become a rule of law state. But in other countries, they move forward already from the rule of law to become a rule of right. I hope that the existing rule of law state can move forward to become a rule of right that we can follow in the future. My second comment, Mr. President, is on CSO, on INGO. I heard many comments from the floor from member states that Laos haven't yet supported strongly CSO or INGO in the country. But I can clarify to you that there are three categories of INGO and CSO in Laos. The first category, INGO and CSO are close partners of economic development for the Lao government. They work with us hand by hand and they come up with a fruitful outcome. The second category of CSO, they behave themselves like secret, like not fully cooperate with the government. We call them a lonely rider. So I think this SEO should be encouraged to work with the government so they can get a full information, official information from the Lao government and from the other embassy in Laos, but not from the shadow report collecting from the rumor, from whatever they can call. It's not incorrect information. The third CSO NGO, they are not inside the country, they are outside the country. They cannot get any information from the report, the exact report from Laos. I think this one is not very fruitful and productive. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency and the delegation for the presentation and participation in this review. The report of the review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, namely the representatives of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, and Italy. In accordance with the procedure implemented in 2015, The recommendations section will be distributed on Thursday, 23rd of January at 6 p.m. for adoption on Friday, 24 January as from 3 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, 7 February 2020. I'll now return the floor to Your Excellency.
Sorry, Mr. President, I interrupt your statement. I thought that I should be the last speaker to express my comment to the meeting. Mr. President, our meeting come to an end. We spent 3 hours together and exchanged view on a very important issue. 96 member states have the floor, covering more than 120 topics and issues on human rights to Laos. So I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep thanks and appreciation to all member states sitting here today for giving us a directive, a guidance, recommendation, proposal, so Laos can improve its human rights in its country. I hope that few comments will be followed by our improvement in the next 5 years when we come back again in this meeting. And also I would like to commend Mr. Chairman for your very competent chairmanship, for your very strict control on the timing. I should learn from you how to control the timing of my delegation so we can maintain our tie correctly. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, once again, I appreciate all the comments from the floor, from members of the country, and from you staff here behind the scene that held us for this meeting. Once again, thank you. And please be reminded that you are my invitation to visit my country very soon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for your kind words of appreciation. This brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for the review of Spain. Speaking time will be 1 minute for all. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform the Secretariat at the latest 30 minutes before the start of the review. Finally, all participants are invited to be in the room on time. I thank you very much. The meeting is closed.
ผลงานเร็วแหลมของรัฐบาลโจรเห็นแล้วสังเวชอีโตนพี่น้องทุกคนที่ประสบภัยบ้านเรือนเพพังบ่เหลืออีหยังน้ำพัดพาไปเวรกรรมซ้ำเติมภาครัฐก่อไว้ทุกกายทุกใจสุดซ้ำลำเค็งเห็นแล้วอาณาพี่น้องห่วมศาสตร์จงเมืองบาดาลทุกครั้งนี้แสนทรมานมาเหือนปาทานอดอยากยากเข็นน้ำตาไหลนองอยากให้พี่น้องนั้นมาได้เห็นเกิดแผลครั้งนี้เหมือนตายครั้งเป็นหมดเนื้อหมดตัวเสียบ้านเสียเหือนขอบคุณสาวไทยที่มีน้ำใจมาช่วยบ่เหมือนทักลัดหิ่งสวยนอกจากบ่สวยแถมยังบิดเบือนปิดกันข่าวสารคนเขาประจานทุกบ้านทุกเมืองเขียดใหญ่ว่ารัฐบาลของว่าบ้านเราประสบการณ์จะบิดเบือนข่าวไปฮอดใสคนลาวทำศาสตร์ขัดกันบ่ขาดหักพอแพงกันบ่เคยลืมเสื้อชาติพันธุ์ว่าเราเฮานั้นเป็นมาจังใดพี่น้องเดือดร้อนต้องเอื้ออาทรบ่แลงน้ำใจช่วยเหลือเกื้อกูลฮักแพงกันไว้เรานอกเราในก็เราคือกันสวยบ่เหมือนทักลัดเฮงสวยนอกจากบ่สวยแถมยังบิดเบือนปิดกันข่าวสารคนเขาประจานทุกบ้านทุกเรือนเขียดใหญ่ว่าน่ะจะดีใช่ไหมเขาว่าจะบิดเบือนข่าวไปฮอดใสคนลาวทำศาสตร์ตัดกันบ่ขาดหักพอแพงกันบ่เคยลืมเสื้อชาติพันธุ์ว่าเราเฮานั้นเป็นมาจังใดพี่น้องเดือดร้อนต้องเอื้ออาทรบ่แลงน้ำใจช่วยเหลือเกื้อกูลฮักแพงกันไว้เรานอกเราในก็เราคือกัน